All right, we interrupt our regular reporting there because we're going to go live now to Moscow, where Vladimir Putin is speaking. He's addressing Russia's Security Council. Have a listen.
Those individuals declared that they formed two independent republics, Donetsk and Lugansk. From that point on, there was an opposition between the Ukrainian government in Kiev and the population. And from the very beginning, we did our utmost to resolve all of the contradictions that were arising. And we used peaceful means to that end. But twice, the government in Kiev carried out punitive military operations on that territory. And it seems as though there is now a third peak in military tensions in this region. And I would like to remind you that for all those years, the residents in those regions have been bullied. They have come under regular mortar fire, artillery fire, and as you well know, the residents that live near the contact line have been forced to live hunkered down in their basements together with their children. Since then, there have been talks, there have been negotiations. And this has led to the declaration of Minsk. This was an attempt at achieving peace. But everything that is happening at the moment demonstrates that the government in Kiev has no intention of implementing the Minsk agreement as announced repeatedly at the highest level of government, in particular by the Security Council and the Foreign Affairs Ministry. So it is clear to everyone that Kiev has zero intention of actually implementing the Minsk agreement. However, Russia has worked hard and will continue to work hard so as to resolve all of those complex issues, complex and tragic issues, using peaceful means. Unfortunately, we are now faced with the situation that you are fully familiar with. And we are here today to talk to each other and discuss what measures should be taken on this front. There are several aspects that I'm referring to. Russia has asked that the sovereignty of those two republics be recognized, but also in reference to the Duma's decision on this front. And we have also called on heads of state and government to recognize the sovereignty and independence of the People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. Meanwhile, I would like to remind you that, of course, these issues are interconnected. They are inherently intertwined to global security issues. Whether across the world or more specifically on the European continent, Ukraine is being instrumentalized. Ukraine is being instrumentalized against Russia, and we are, of course, seeing this as a very serious threat. And that is why, for a number of months, we have ramped up our dialogue with our partners on the other side of the Atlantic via NATO so as to achieve security and peaceful resolution. We need peace and security. We need to create the right conditions for development. However, we need to come to terms with the reality of the current circumstances. And as I said before, if we are faced with this threat of Ukraine accession to NATO, then we believe that this will be a much bigger threat to our country. Article 5 of the NATO Charter stipulates that all NATO members should stand in defense of any NATO member should they come under attack. And since nobody believes that the request of Crimea residents are legitimate, there's always a risk that Ukraine may want to get Crimea back through military means. This would mean that the whole of NATO would be forced to join those military operations. Now we are being told that a number of NATO members are against Ukraine joining NATO. However, in 2008, in Bucharest, a memorandum was signed, and this memorandum opens up NATO's doors to Ukraine and Georgia. And when I ask the question of why they did that, I'm not getting any answer. And there is no answer because of pressure from the U.S. NATO members did it under U.S. pressure, so we're getting no guarantees that this won't happen again. We're getting no guarantees whatsoever because the U.S. go back on a lot of obligations that they're undertaking, on a lot of documents that they've actually signed. So we need a document to be signed, and that would be valid under international law. And for now, we have yet to receive that assurance. So I'm going to hand over to Sergei Lavrov because he is busy at the moment trying to achieve security guarantees with Washington and with Brussels. And then I will hand over to Dmitry Kozak. And he will inform us about his assessment of what is happening in terms of talks and implementation of the Minsk agreement. Everybody will then have an opportunity to speak. But the onus is on us today to explain what the next steps are as far as we're concerned, based on the circumstances, based on the situation that we find ourselves in, and how we see this situation evolving. Minister, you have the floor. President, dear colleagues, as I told the President a week ago, we have prepared an evaluation of the proposed security guarantees, which we received following Russia's initiatives dating back to the end of last year. The reaction of our European counterparts shows that they are not willing to accept proposals that are so key to our eyes. In other words, a ban on NATO's enlargement in Eastern Europe. In other words, NATO is continuing with its open doors policy, and we're getting no positive answer from NATO or from the US to try and resolve this situation. Security is indivisible. This is a principle that is crucial to us, and the U.S. is trying to sidestep that principle. The U.S. is forgetting a key prerequisite. When the time comes to choose an alliance, or at any other time, nobody has the right to strengthen their own security to the detriment of other countries' security. And this is why in January we talked to all of our counterparts, whether in Switzerland or in Western Europe, or counterparts at the European Union or in the U.S. We sent them all an answer that contained our analysis of the documents, of the legal instruments. at OSCE level. Our answer contained our analysis of the situation over time. Since the Rome Initiative, an initiative that was approved by the NATO-Russia Council. There is another aspect regarding relations with NATO and the 1997 documents. Under those documents, Russia and NATO are no longer adversaries, and the goal was to build a partnership, particularly a strategic partnership. And based on that, we suggested going back to the NATO configuration which existed in 1997. This argument was denied, just like the first argument. And in their answer, NATO and the US called on us to stop occupying Crimea and pull out our troops from Ukraine, Crimea, and Moldova. When it comes to Ukraine, the Minsk agreement needs to be emphasized, and it has been emphasized, but only rhetorically. Kiev needs to comply with the provisions of that most important document. Now, the answer does not rule out the possibility of deploying armament at the borders with Russia, but the U.S. suggested reopening talks on medium and long-range missiles, air, or rather ground-based missiles. And the question came up when the U.S. left the treaty and failed to accept Mr. Putin's proposal of a mutual moratorium with adequate verification measures. So the U.S. came up with other proposals regarding working together, transparency, predictability, and those suggestions from the U.S. are very close to our own suggestions to our U.S. partners and our NATO partners. However, in their answer, there are excerpts from the package that we were proposing, and there are other aspects that are being addressed, such as security issues at sea or in the sky, military contacts, civilian hotlines, mechanisms for preventing dangerous military incidents. So our general impression is that our counterparts are trying to take our package of proposals and are trying to extract a number of things that seem to us secondary. And of course, they could help reduce risks to some extent, but those aspects are secondary and would not constrain NATO or the U.S. when it comes to distribution of powers and troops around our space. In addition, our partners are setting a condition: de-escalation around Ukraine. In other words, Russia is asked to take action first. So we're seeing that there are minor advances in the answers of our European partners. However, the initiatives that we took in December and the fact that we persevered with those initiatives has made it possible for our U.S. and NATO partners to take into account some of our proposals in terms of arms control and reducing existing tensions. This work, this dialogue must continue. Our answer has been detailed, but we have only sent it to the U.S. And that is our answer to the second proposal. So why did we first answer the U.S.? Because NATO is secondary. In other words, NATO will only decide what to do once Washington has taken a stance. The Munich Security Conference, which just ended, has once again heard every Western country speak in support of a joint position that is based on the U.S. position. And this is why we first sent the answer validated by you, Mr. President, to our U.S. partners. Now, the main thing that we addressed or exemplified is this. Our position isn't a menu that can freely select from, nor is it an ultimatum. Our answer is based on the following basics. This global situation requires a holistic solution. We need to take into account all of those moving parts that dovetail together. As you rightly said, Mr. President, what is key is the relationships between Russia and the Western world, spearheaded by the U.S. So once again, we emphasize that the Russian initiative from December is a package of measures. And what we are trying to achieve in this dialogue that we will, of course, continue, what we are trying to achieve is to get answers to those questions that are so important to us. NATO needs to stop expanding towards the east. NATO needs to limit its presence on the European continent, particularly in Central and Eastern European countries, in light of the initial agreements and declarations between NATO and Russia. Our first demand is this. This document that was signed, according to which nobody should expand their security to the detriment of the security of their counterparts, how come this document is being ignored? We need Western countries to explain why they signed that document and now show they have zero intention of putting their money where their mouth is. Upon your request, we have sent this document to Washington. I received a call from Anthony Blinken. He let me know that they have now read our answer, and he is ready to meet with me to discuss this, explain the U.S. position, maybe have a discussion and ask questions. You have green-lighted this meeting, which will take place on February 24th, so this week in Geneva. And we will base ourselves on the position that you stand for. When you talk to your counterparts and the Foreign Affairs Ministry will continue to advance that position as well. I discussed this with my U.S. counterpart, and the U.S. President has assured me that Ukraine would not become a NATO member tomorrow, and that there was the possibility of a moratorium. And maybe this is because Mr. Biden does not believe Ukraine to be ready at this point. And my answer was this. This is you being free to do what you want to do. This is about your freedom of action. What you're saying is that the moratorium is in your interest, not in ours, because once Ukraine is ready, you are free to admit them into NATO. So we talked until 2 a.m., and he told me that, well, the U.S. position had shifted, and when I asked why or how, he was unable to tell me. So I do believe that we first need to understand what those tremors are all about. Why has the U.S. position shifted slightly? Your counterpart said publicly yesterday that the position in principle regarding NATO enlargement had not changed, that NATO is opening its doors to other countries, including Ukraine, that nothing had changed. Am I understanding this properly? Mr. President, despite the secret documents that are finding their way into the media, particularly Western media, secret documents regarding agreements with Russia or agreements between different Western countries, at the time those documents came out, Western countries had no intention to expand eastward. And yet, the NATO Secretary General actually denies those documents ever existed. And yet those documents have been declassified by the UK government. So we need NATO to discontinue their open doors policy. In the Washington Agreement, there is a possibility, should all NATO members agree unanimously, to open their doors to additional members, assuming those members meet NATO criteria, and if their membership will increase NATO's level of security. And this is a criterion that has been ignored by NATO for a long time now. But when it comes to this change in the U.S. position and in the position of their Western allies, we agree with your position, the position that you expressed to French President, Mr. Macron. We first need to understand what this change means. Our French counterparts say that they understand what those potential changes or shifts from Washington mean. So, in agreement with you, I have planned to talk with the French Foreign Affairs Ministry, and I have asked our French counterparts to make sure we can address that issue of potential shifts in the U.S. position and potential proposals on that front. Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Dmitry Kozak. I have asked him to give us an overview of what happened in terms of implementation of the Minsk agreement. I'm referring to the third echelon, and then other members of the Security Council of the Russian Federation will have an opportunity to speak and explain the situation in the two People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. Mr. President, dear colleagues, I do not wish to bore you with the details of such complex negotiations regarding implementation of the Minsk agreement. It is now obvious that neither Ukraine nor its Western allies are interested in Donbass. They are doing their utmost for that conflict to be set in stone. They managed to plant that seed in the minds of the world that this conflict is a conflict between Russia and the European, and that Russia is responsible for that conflict. And yet, we are paying a dear price. We are sending humanitarian help. We are helping that territory because our own Russian citizens are in distress there. In Donbass today, or rather before that conflict erupted, many jobs had been created. Unemployment was down, the economy was recovering, things were going quite well. in line with our economic policy goals. Now, when it comes to Ukraine, it is obvious that neither Ukraine nor Western countries want to resolve the conflict in Donbass. They want that conflict to continue. Now, this is a hypothetical, but what about Donbass and how to integrate it into Ukraine? Well, they are at a loss for words. They look down, they can't answer, they have no idea how to answer that question. And when it comes to Donbass, I believe there is no need to explain the economic and political reasons. No. Tell us how the talks are going regarding the Minsk agreement. Well, the talks have been at a standstill since 2015. As you well know, under the Minsk agreement, there is to be a dialogue on the status of Donbass following the conflict. And this dialogue was supposed to start as soon as heavy weapons had been withdrawn from the contact line. So the heavy armament was officially pulled out. And that was over on March 8th. We were supposed to start the dialogue the next day, on March 9th. And by the end of 2015, we should have seen amendments to the Ukrainian constitution. And those amendments should have been validated or approved by the population of Donbass. Now, against the backdrop of the amended constitution, elections should have taken place. But the dialogue has not started. And Ukraine is keeping mum on the status of Donbass and what their plans are on that front. Maybe they're thinking ordinary Ukrainian municipalities without any kind of specific status, and Ukraine has managed to. The Ukrainian government has managed to convince its public opinion that that part of the Minsk agreement on the republics of Donetsk and Lugansk are impossible to implement. And that if that precedent was accepted, then the other regions of Ukraine would follow suit and would also try to break away. There is, for example, a similar request emerging in Western Ukraine, and the Ukrainian government firmly believes that, and their public opinion now firmly believes it as well. Now, in terms of the talks on the Minsk agreement, they recognize that the agreement is important. But as soon as they're out of the room, officially they say that this agreement is a noose around their neck and that there is no way of implementing it. So I talked to my French counterpart yesterday, and he said to me that the Ukrainian government was ready to implement the Minsk agreement and even has new ideas in terms of implementation, and particularly the elections, in line with the Steinmeier formula. Allow me to say this again. This has been going on for 8 years. Ukraine found itself in funny circumstances at times because they are lying through their teeth.
Яркий пример был самый последний, 17 сентября прошлого года, говорит, Россия – страна конфликта.
You see things, they are written on paper, and yet they deny that those things have been written. Maybe, and part of my joke, maybe this has been written in invisible ink. So I asked, do you believe Russia to be the attacker? In that case, do help the Germans and the French detail what they think Russia should do. That way we wouldn't be accused of creating our own obligations.
реально заняли наступательную позицию, у них предложение по выполнению Минских
We are
соглашений
willing to
огромное
help.
множество, стали переговоры.
What is the
Не
situation in
знаем,
Donbass?
что не выполняет Донбасс.
Is it that
Сформулировать не
they
можем, вы сами
themselves
придумайте.
refuse to implement part of the Minsk agreement? And my answer is, our answer is, no, we don't know.
Да, конечно. Конечно, у них
Maybe
нет
you can tell
позиции ни
us.
по одному вопросу. Они не знают, какие обязательства должна быть нести Россия, какие обязательства
So they do not have a
должен
position.
выполнить или
They
отказывается
do
выполнить.
not know what Russia's obligations would be. Please clarify, says Mr. Putin, with regard to items 9, 11, and 12 of the Minsk agreement. Under the agreement, decisions need to be made as part of a dialogue, rather as part of a consultation process with the representatives of the republics concerned. Now, despite what the Minsk agreement says, I think that last time we brought a German dictionary to Berlin, and yet they consider that there is no need for a direct dialogue with the representatives of the republic. The paper says consultations. They don't believe this to mean a direct call for dialogue. That's what Ukraine is saying. So President Macron said that this dialogue needs to take place as part of the contact group and under supervision of OSCE. But the three-way contact group is overseeing everything under the aegis of OSCE. That is always how things are happening. Donbass is putting forward proposals to the three-way contact group. The OSCE is always supervising what is happening. But when Donbass is expressing itself, Ukraine refuses to listen. And when we ask them to respond to the claims, they say, well, only if Russia tells us to. There is hysteria in Ukraine. Last year, Ukraine said that Russia was putting forward an ultimatum that the conflict in Ukraine was a sovereign matter and that there should be no interference. They say that they need to operate as part of a dialogue with Russia. And when Russia suggests measures to implement the Minsk agreement, what we get in return is hysteria and much talk about Russian interference into Russian internal affairs. So they are trying to provoke us so they can then accuse us of interference. Back to the Minsk agreement. Can we interpret the agreement as follows? It is not up to the self-proclaimed republics to advance proposals. No, it is up to the Ukrainian government to do that. So that is the latest proposal that came out on February 10th in Berlin. These are legal quibbles. Since we're dealing with the Ukrainian constitution, then the initiative is in the hands and should be in the hands of the Ukrainian government. So what happens in the case of amendments to those initiatives? What happens if Ukrainian proposals make zero sense? What happens if Donbass has an alternative? Would the proposed amendment be explored? The answer isn't very conclusive. They look down, they refuse to answer, they say they don't know. So the Ukrainians are very inventive. They keep coming up with reasons reasons why their own proposals cannot be discussed. Obviously, if Russia speaks against it, then we're guilty of interference, and if Donbass opposes their proposals, then these people are separatists and they don't have a say. This is a key aspect of the Minsk agreement. Under that key aspect, those amendments to the Constitution must be the subject of consultations with the self-proclaimed republics. Is that aspect being neglected? Yes, it is being ignored entirely. It feels as though those lawyers are simply refusing to have an actual conversation. We're dealing with two separate conversations taking place at the same time. OSCE is overseeing the three-way contact group, which is a total black box. This way of operating is completely artificial. Dear colleagues, one last question. The government in Kiev, does it intend to implement the Minsk agreement? If the situation continues as it has, the answer is no, absolutely not. It is clear that the Ukrainian government has zero intention of implementing the agreement. May I say a few more words regarding Donbass? Should we accept Donbass as part of Russia? Yes or no? This is a serious issue. What do you think?
Well,
I'll tell you what. For now, let's leave it at that. When it comes to implementing the talks, continuing the talks so as to implement the Minsk agreement, let's leave it at that. I understand that your assessment of our future prospects isn't very optimistic. We're going to leave it at that for now. And I would like to hand over to the FSB director. Please tell us more about what is happening along the border. What about refugee numbers? How are they being tracked by border police? Yes, a quick update on the border situation. Mr. President, we are seeing a deterioration of the situation in the People's Republic.
We've been listening there to an extraordinary session of the Russian Security Council chaired by the President Vladimir Putin. A key moment during that address was when Putin said that Russia is now considering a request to recognize the independence of Luhansk and Donetsk. Those are those two breakaway regions in the east of Ukraine. We heard as well from Dmitry Kozak, he's the Deputy Kremlin Chief of Staff, and from Sergei Lavrov, the Foreign Minister of Russia. Confirmation from him that Lavrov is to meet with the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, on Thursday. Well, listening to a bit of that with me was Jake Cordell, who's in Moscow for us. Jake, first of all, how significant do you think it is that we are getting that confirmation today that Lavrov is to meet with Antony Blinken on Thursday? I mean, that's surely a suggestion that we probably won't see a full-scale invasion before then.
That's probably right, yes. And remember, part of this meeting was supposed to be to potentially lay the groundwork for a summit between Vladimir Putin and Emmanuel Macron. That was dismissed earlier by the Kremlin. They say it's premature to think about that summit. I think part of the concern we heard from the Kremlin about signing up to a presidential summit was they suspected the US were just playing for time, that they weren't really going to offer anything new. And that's basically what we just heard today. We heard all the officials line up to say they don't think Ukraine is serious about negotiations. They haven't heard anything new from the US. The US is just going through the motions. It's not willing to offer any guarantees. And even if it were to offer guarantees, we heard them say that US guarantees aren't worth the paper they're written on. So while it should be seen as a good step for diplomacy that meeting is going to go ahead on Thursday, I think this is the kind of timeframes we're operating on now, that we're just looking 1 or 2 days ahead.
So this is the summit we're talking about between Biden and Macron as well. Now, talk to us about the significance of the confirmation today that Vladimir Putin is at least considering recognizing those two regions I mentioned, Donetsk and Luhansk. What do you make of that confirmation today?
Yeah, this would be quite a big step if Putin were to recognize those regions' independence. Last week, Russia's parliament passed a bill calling on him to recognize their independence. He said he didn't want to do that because he still believes that the Minsk process, that's the ceasefire deal which ended the fighting in 2015, he believes that still has life. Now, this meeting where he said he was considering recognizing it, and then we heard Lavrov and Kozak line up to say that they don't believe the Minsk process has any life left. This is all very highly choreographed. And although Putin didn't make any decisions, it certainly looks like he's taking down that path, and he is at least considering it. That would, of course, blow up the peace agreement that was signed in 2015. What we don't know is how the West would react to that step. We've heard how the West would react to an invasion, but how would they react to Russian recognition of these pro-Russian states? That's something we don't know yet.
Jake Cordell, live in Moscow. Thanks very much indeed for your snap analysis to that Security Council meeting we were just hearing a bit of there in Moscow. Now, also listening to that with me was our Foreign Affairs editor, Armin Georgian, who's with me here in Paris. And Armin, overall, I mean, what was your impression listening to that? Is it your sense that there was a sort of hardening of the rhetoric, or is this really language we've heard before from Russian leaders?
No, I think it's more of the same. This is very much Groundhog Day, Nadia. It's the same talking points that are being hit by Russian officials, but also by Western officials in talking about this crisis. Overall, you know, looking at all the diplomacy over the last few weeks, I don't really get the impression that the needle has moved, really. I can't really sense that it has. So we heard from, of course, President Putin, who gave the broad sort of, you know, geostrategic picture, the lack of long-term guarantees to Russia from NATO. He was hammering that talking point again. We heard then the Russian foreign minister hitting the same talking points as he has done previously about how the proposals for the West are partially interesting. There are some issues that can and should be discussed, but they are secondary issues. So he reiterated that. And then, of course, a gloomy assessment of the Normandy format talks by, as you said, the deputy head of the Russian presidential administration, Dmitry Kozak, who I think gave, although it was very detailed, it was pretty hard to follow all of the ins and outs, I think it's fair to say. But I think overall he gave a pretty clear idea of just how wide the gap is in the different interpretations of the Minsk Protocol, and particularly on the question of, are the separatists actually legitimate interlocutors or not? For Russia, of course, they are. For Ukraine, they are deemed terrorists, and this is kind of the core difficulty, or at the center of trying to take this whole Minsk diplomacy forward. But all we can say is that the diplomatic track has not come to an end. There is this meeting now that has been officially confirmed by the Russian side of Lavrov and Blinken in Geneva on the 24th of February. So clearly there is still something to talk about, but increasingly, I must admit, I'm finding it hard to see exactly how the two sides think they're going to move ahead. Considering, Nadia, they've been stuck now since, what was it, late December, early January, when the Geneva rounds of diplomacy really kicked off between the US and Russia. Things haven't substantially moved since then.
And Jake Cordell in Moscow asking the question then of how would the West react if Russia was to recognize these republics of Donetsk and Luhansk? We haven't actually heard much from Western leaders as to how they might feel about that.
No, I haven't heard that either. I think certainly the French President Emmanuel Macron is very much focused on the Minsk Accords, and so is Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor. Those two leaders are really trying to keep what is left of that process, if ever there was much in the first place, together. And no, I mean, I'm not aware of any other plan or backup plan or anything like that. Certainly not in the West. But I think, again, the key issue is, does Macron particularly, and to some extent Olaf Scholz, do they really have an in with Ukrainian authorities at this point, given how this military build-up around Ukraine makes it very, very hard for any Ukrainian officials to publicly say anything that could be even slightly construed as a concession to the separatist leaders. So that is really the bind that France and Germany find themselves in right now when it comes to the Minsk process. But of course, as I said, none of this is new. We've been stuck in this same paradigm now for weeks and weeks.
Armin Georgian, thanks very much indeed for your analysis on the programme as well. We are going to take a short break here in the newsroom. Do stay with us, though, on France 24. There'll be more news headlines for you in about 20 minutes.